Every science eventually reaches a point where its methods stop producing answers. Physics hit this wall with quantum measurement. Biology hit it with the origin of life. The study of the mind hits it with consciousness. Not because consciousness is mystical, but because the standard explanatory tools of science seem structurally unable to close the gap between objective description and subjective experience. This is not a single puzzle. It is an interlocking set of problems that constrain one another in unexpected ways. A solution to one often generates a new version of another. Functionalism dissolves the knowledge argument, but invites absent qualia. Physicalism handles causal closure, but stumbles on conceivability. Panpsychism avoids the emergence problem, but inherits the combination problem. Every move in this space has a cost, and most introductory treatments hide the bill. What follows is a reconstruction of the entire landscape of consciousness studies as a connected argument. Each position will be built from the problem that forced it into existence. Each critique will be presented at full force, without premature resolution. The goal is not to survey what philosophers believe, but to make the pressure that produced each view fully visible. The order is roughly logical rather than historical, beginning with the foundational arguments that set the constraints every later theory must respect. The audience for this is someone who already knows the standard positions and their textbook objections. The aim is to go one level deeper into the tensions that remain genuinely unresolved, the recent reformulations that have changed the terms of debate, and the objections that even defenders of a view find hardest to answer. Part 1. What is it like to be something? Nagel and the subjectivity problem. Start with a deceptively simple observation about explanation in the natural sciences. When physics explains heat, it identifies heat with mean molecular kinetic energy. The explanation works because everything we wanted to know about heat, its transfer, its measurement, its effects on materials, can be derived from facts about molecular motion. Nothing is left over. The explanandum is fully captured by the explanans. Now consider a neuroscientist studying echolocation in bats. She can map every neural pathway from the bat's auditory cortex to its motor outputs. She can model the precise timing of ultrasonic pulses and their returning echoes. She can predict the bat's flight trajectory through a dark cave with arbitrary accuracy. She has, in a strong sense, explained echolocation. But Thomas Nagel, in his 1974 paper, identified a specific feature of this explanation that differs from the heat case. With heat, once you have the molecular story, there is no further fact that resists capture. With the bat, even after the complete neural and behavioral story is told, there seems to be something left over. There is something it is like for the bat to perceive through sonar. That subjective character, the bat's own point of view on its ecolocatory experience, does not appear anywhere in the third-person description. The critical move in Nagel's argument is not the vague claim that subjectivity is mysterious. It is the precise structural point that objective descriptions are, by their nature, perspectiveless. A complete physics or neuroscience aspires to a view from nowhere, progressively abstracting away from any particular point of view. But conscious experience is constitutively perspectival. It exists only from a point of view. So the more objective our description becomes, the further it moves from the target phenomenon. This generates a dilemma that is sharper than it first appears. If our best explanatory methods require increasing objectivity, and the thing to be explained is essentially subjective, then explanatory success and descriptive accuracy pull in opposite directions. This is not a claim that consciousness is non-physical. Nagel explicitly says he is not arguing for dualism. He is arguing that our current concept of physical explanation has a structural limitation that prevents it from accommodating subjectivity. The common response, often attributed to Daniel Dennett, is that Nagel has confused epistemic limitations with metaphysical ones. We cannot know what it is like to be a bat because we lack the relevant sensory apparatus, not because there is some ontologically special property floating free of the physical. On this reading, the subjective character of experience is just the way certain physical states present themselves to the organisms that have them. There is no residual fact beyond the functional and physical story. But this response has a precise vulnerability that Nagel anticipated. Even in our own case, the third-person description seems to leave something out. A neuroscientist examining her own brain scan while experiencing the colour red has access to two bodies of information that do not obviously converge. She knows everything the scan tells her about neural activation patterns in visual cortex. She also knows what red looks like from the inside. The question is whether the second kind of knowledge is fully captured by the first, and if so, what the mechanism of that capture could be. Nagel's argument does not answer this question. It is deliberately diagnostic rather than therapeutic. It identifies a structural feature of the problem space without proposing a solution. This restraint is precisely what made the argument productive, because it separated two questions that had been run together. First, is there a genuine explanatory gap between objective description and subjective experience? Second, if so, does that gap reflect an ontological difference or merely a conceptual one? The first question is Nagel's. The second question is what every subsequent position in the philosophy of consciousness is trying to answer. But Nagel's formulation also contains an ambiguity that would generate decades of further work. When he says there is something it is like to be a bat, does the explanatory resistance come from the qualitative character of bat experience, from the subjective perspective itself, or from both? These can come apart. You might think the problem is specifically about qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain. Or you might think the problem is about perspective as such, the sheer fact that there is a point of view at all, regardless of its qualitative content. Nagel's language is compatible with both readings, and different subsequent programs take different sides. Part 2. The Explanatory Gap. Nagel's paper established that subjective experience resists a certain kind of objective explanation, but it left unspecified exactly where in the explanatory chain the resistance occurs. Joseph Levine's 1983 paper on the explanatory gap provides that specificity, and its contribution is frequently conflated with Chalmers's hard problem, despite doing fundamentally different philosophical work. Consider a standard scientific identity claim. Water is H2O. This identity is necessary if true. There is no possible world where water is not H2O. But it is also explanatory in a particular sense. Once you know the molecular composition of water, you can derive its observable properties, its boiling point, its transparency, its role as a solvent. The identity does not merely state a brute fact. It makes the connection between the two sides of the identity intelligible. Now consider a proposed psychophysical identity. Pain is C fiber firing. Suppose this identity is true. Even granting its truth, Levine argues, there is an asymmetry with the water case. From the fact that C fibers are firing, you cannot derive, even in principle, what the experience of pain is like. You can derive that the organism will withdraw its hand, report discomfort, exhibit stress hormones. You can derive every functional and behavioral consequence. What you cannot derive is the qualitative character, the specific way pain feels from the inside. This is the explanatory gap. It is not a claim about what exists. Levine is explicit that the gap is epistemic, not metaphysical. He is not saying pain is something over and above C fiber firing. He is saying that even if the identity is true, it remains unintelligible to us in a way the water identity does not. We are left with a brute correlation rather than a transparent explanation. The distinction between Levine and Nagel is worth marking precisely. Nagel argues that objective methods cannot capture subjective character because of a structural mismatch between perspectives. Levine argues something more specific, that psychophysical identities fail to meet the same standard of explanatory transparency that other scientific identities meet. You do not need to invoke perspectives or subjectivity to state Levine's point. You only need the observation that physical descriptions entail functional roles, but do not entail qualitative character. This specificity matters because it constrains the available responses differently. Against Nagel, one can argue that objectivity and subjectivity are compatible, that a science can acknowledge perspective without abandoning rigor. Against Levine, one must explain why psychophysical identities lack the explanatory force of other scientific identities, or else deny that they do. The standard physicalist response invokes a posteriori necessity. Just as it is necessarily true that water is H2O, even though the identity is knowable only through empirical investigation, the identity between pain and C fiber firing is necessary despite being discoverable only a posteriori. On this view, the explanatory gap reflects our mode of access to the identity, not a real gap in nature. Levine's reply cuts directly at this analogy. In the water case, the a posteriori character of the identity does not leave any explanatory residue. Once you learn the molecular facts, you understand why water has the properties it does. But in the pain case, learning the neural facts does not produce this understanding. You are left with the sense that the connection between C fiber firing and the felt quality of pain is arbitrary, that the neural state could, in principle, have felt some other way or no way at all. This residual sense of contingency is the gap, and appealing to a posteriori necessity does not close it. This argument has a contemporary sharpness that the textbook version often obscures. The explanatory gap is not merely a claim about our current ignorance. It is a claim about the form of explanation itself. Physical explanations work by showing how a phenomenon's properties follow from the properties of its constituents. If qualitative character does not follow from physical properties in this way, then no amount of additional physical information will close the gap. The problem is not that we lack data, but that the data are of the wrong kind to entail the explanandum. The deepest unresolved question about the explanatory gap is whether it tracks a genuine feature of reality or a limitation of human cognition. Levine himself remains neutral on this. He treats the gap as a datum to be explained, not as evidence for any particular metaphysics. But this neutrality is unstable, because every theory of consciousness must either close the gap, explain it away, or accept it as permanent. And each of these strategies carries significant costs that the next several parts will make visible. Part 3. The hard problem and why it resists normal explanation. The explanatory gap identifies a deficit in a specific type of identity claim. David Chalmers, in his 1995 paper, generalized this into a far more sweeping challenge to physicalism as a whole. The distinction he draws between easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness has become so familiar that its actual logical structure is often lost in the retelling. The easy problems are easy, not because they are simple, but because they have a recognizable explanatory form. Explaining how the brain integrates information, discriminates stimuli, controls behavior, or reports internal states are all problems that could in principle be solved by identifying the right computational or neural mechanism. Each of these is a question about how the brain performs a function, and we know what it would look like to answer such a question. We would specify the mechanism and show how it produces the relevant input-output mapping. The hard problem is hard because it has a different structure entirely. Even after every function has been explained, every mechanism identified, every behavioral capacity accounted for, a further question remains. Why is any of this processing accompanied by subjective experience? Why does it feel like something to see red rather than the visual system simply discriminating wavelengths and guiding behavior in the dark? The force of the hard problem depends on a specific premise that is often stated too quickly. The premise is that functional explanation is constitutively unable to account for phenomenal consciousness. Here is why. A functional explanation identifies a phenomenon with a causal role. Something is what it does within the system. But for any causal role you specify, it seems conceivable that the role could be filled without any accompanying experience. The system could discriminate wavelengths, report seeing red, even introspect, and say the experience is vivid, all without there being anything it is like to undergo those processes. This is not a claim about what is physically possible. It is a claim about the explanatory structure of functional accounts. Because a functional account explains by specifying causal roles, and because causal roles are defined by their relational properties, the intrinsic qualitative character of experience has no place within the explanatory framework. It is not that functionalism gives the wrong answer about consciousness. It is that consciousness, understood as phenomenal experience, is not the kind of thing functional explanation is structured to address. Chalmers's argument differs from Levine's in a crucial way. Levine identifies an explanatory gap within a specific type of identity statement. Chalmers argues that the gap arises for any explanation that proceeds by identifying mechanisms and functions. This means the hard problem is not a problem with a particular reductive strategy, but with the reductive framework as such. If Chalmers is right, no refinement of neuroscience, no new imaging technology, no more detailed computational model will close the gap, because the gap is structural, not empirical. A neurosurgeon directly stimulating a patient's visual cortex during an awake craniotomy sees this concretely. She applies a small electrical current, and the patient reports seeing a flash of blue light. She can map the precise neural population whose activation correlates with the blue flash. She can even predict, based on stimulation parameters, whether the patient will report blue versus green. But none of this tells her why activating these neurons produces the experience of blue rather than the experience of green, or rather than no experience at all. The correlation is empirically robust, but explanatorily opaque. The most sophisticated physicalist response does not deny the appearance of a gap. It denies that the gap is what it seems. Type B materialists accept that there is an epistemic gap between physical and phenomenal truths, but deny that this epistemic gap reflects an ontological one. On their view, phenomenal truths are physical truths, but the connection between them is not a priori deducible. This is the same structure as the water and H2O case, they argue, just felt more viscerally because of the special character of phenomenal concepts. Chalmers anticipated this response and constructed two major arguments against it, the zombie argument and the knowledge argument. Both attempt to show that the epistemic gap is evidence for an ontological gap. Whether they succeed turns on highly technical questions in modal epistemology and the philosophy of language that the next two parts will develop in detail. But the key structural point to hold is this: the hard problem is not a mood, not a feeling of puzzlement, not an expression of wonder. It is a precise claim about the explanatory limits of functional and physical characterization, and the debate over its reality is, in effect, the debate over whether physicalism is true. Part 4. Qualia, the knowledge argument, and what Mary learns. The hard problem claims that functional explanation leaves phenomenal consciousness unexplained. Frank Jackson's knowledge argument attempts to convert this explanatory claim into a metaphysical one, to show that physicalism is not merely incomplete in practice, but false in principle. The argument begins with a scenario that is deliberately designed to eliminate every possible source of ignorance except one. Mary is a neuroscientist who has spent her entire life in a black-and-white room. She has learned every physical fact about color vision, the wavelengths, the retinal responses, the neural processing pathways, the behavioral dispositions, the functional roles. Her physical knowledge is stipulated to be complete. Then, one day, she leaves the room and sees a red tomato for the first time. Jackson's claim is that Mary learns something new. She learns what it is like to see red. If this is correct, then her prior knowledge, which included all physical facts, was not complete after all. There is at least one fact about color experience that is not a physical fact. If there are facts that are not physical facts, then physicalism is false. The argument structure is simple, but its vulnerability is specific and revealing. It depends on the inference from Mary gains new knowledge to there exists a new fact she learns. This inference can be blocked in two ways, and the debate over which blocking strategy works has generated some of the most precise work in contemporary philosophy of mind. The first strategy, associated with David Lewis and Lawrence Nemiro, is the ability hypothesis. When Mary sees red, she does not learn a new fact. She acquires a new ability, the ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember what red looks like. These are practical capacities, not propositional knowledge. Just as learning to ride a bicycle does not reveal new facts about physics, learning to recognize red does not reveal new facts about the world. The ability hypothesis faces a precise difficulty that emerged in subsequent debate. Consider Mary 1 month after leaving the room, sitting in her study with her eyes closed. She can now think about what it was like to see red. She can form beliefs about the similarity and difference between red and orange experiences. She can reason about whether her red experience matched her prior theoretical predictions. These are paradigmatically propositional activities, forming beliefs with truth conditions, not merely exercising abilities. If what Mary gained were merely abilities, it is unclear how those abilities could ground new propositional thoughts that she could not have formed before. The second strategy is the acquaintance hypothesis, developed recently by Earl Coney and defended in various forms by others. Mary does not gain new factual knowledge at all. She gains acquaintance with a property she already knew about under a different mode of presentation. She knew all the facts about red experience before leaving the room, but knowing about an experience and being acquainted with it are different epistemic relations. The new relation does not introduce a new fact into her ontology. This is more promising, but it faces a dilemma that Chalmers has pressed forcefully. Either acquaintance with red experience provides Mary with new information, in which case the physicalist problem returns. Or it provides no new information, in which case it is mysterious why the acquaintance relation feels so epistemically significant. If Mary genuinely learns nothing at all, not even in an attenuated sense, her shock of recognition when she first sees red is entirely unmotivated. She would respond to seeing red the way you respond to being told something you already know. The currently most active physicalist response is neither the ability hypothesis nor the acquaintance hypothesis in their classic forms. It is the phenomenal concept strategy, which gets its own part later because of its centrality to the debate. For now, the important structural point is that the knowledge argument isolates a specific kind of knowledge, phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of what an experience is like, that resists assimilation to physical knowledge in a way that demands explanation from any side of the debate. What makes the knowledge argument so durable is not that it is unanswerable, but that every answer to it generates a further commitment with its own costs. The ability hypothesis must explain propositional phenomenal thought. The acquaintance hypothesis must explain why acquaintance seems informationally loaded. The phenomenal concept strategy must explain why phenomenal concepts have the features that generate epistemic gaps without those features themselves requiring a non-physical explanation. Jackson himself eventually rejected his own argument and became a physicalist, but the problem he identified has outlasted every particular formulation of it. Part 5. Zombies, Conceivability, and Two-Dimensional Semantics. The knowledge argument works by holding the physical facts fixed and showing something appears to be left out. The zombie argument works from the other direction, by holding phenomenal consciousness as absent and showing the physical facts can apparently remain intact. A philosophical zombie is a being physically identical to you in every respect, down to every particle, every neural connection, every functional state, but with no phenomenal consciousness whatsoever. There is nothing it is like to be a zombie. The zombie processes visual information, reports seeing colours, recoils from pain, even says that its experiences are vivid and ineffable. But all of this occurs in the dark, with no inner light of experience. Chalmers's argument proceeds in 2 steps. Step 1. Zombies are conceivable. We can form a coherent conception of a being physically identical to us, but lacking consciousness. Step 2. If zombies are conceivable, they are metaphysically possible. If zombies are metaphysically possible, then consciousness is not necessitated by the physical facts. If consciousness is not necessitated by the physical facts, physicalism is false. The overwhelming majority of the philosophical response has focused on the inference from conceivability to possibility in step 2. This is where two-dimensional semantics becomes load-bearing, and it is where most introductory treatments stop too early. The standard objection runs as follows. Conceivability does not entail possibility. Before Goldbach's conjecture is proven or refuted, we can conceive of it being false. But if it is necessarily true, as many mathematicians suspect, then our conceiving of its falsity does not establish its possibility. Perhaps the zombie scenario is like this. Superficially conceivable, but impossible due to some necessary connection between the physical and the phenomenal that we cannot grasp a priori. Chalmers' defense against this objection draws on his two-dimensional semantic framework. The core idea is that every concept has two associated intentions, two functions from possible worlds to extensions. The primary intention of a concept tracks how its reference is fixed, what it picks out as a matter of meaning and a priori reasoning. The secondary intention tracks what the concept refers to in all possible worlds, given what it actually refers to. For water, the primary intention picks out whatever plays the water role in any given scenario, the clear, drinkable liquid in rivers and lakes. The secondary intention picks out H2O in every possible world, because water is actually H2O. On Twin Earth, where XYZ plays the water role, the primary intention of water would pick out XYZ. But the secondary intention of our word water would not pick out XYZ, because water is necessarily H2O. Chalmers argues that the zombie scenario is not like the Goldbach case. When we conceive of zombies, we are not making a mathematical error. We are conceiving of a scenario that is coherent at the level of primary intentions. Physical concepts and phenomenal concepts have distinct primary intentions. The a priori conditions for their application are different. There is no a priori entailment from one to the other. And in the two-dimensional framework, primary conceivability is a reliable guide to primary possibility. The critical premise is that primary conceivability entails primary possibility for ideal conceivers. An ideal conceiver is one who makes no errors of reasoning and has full command of the a priori connections between concepts. If such a conceiver finds no contradiction in the zombie scenario, then the scenario is primarily possible, and primary possibility is sufficient for there being a possible world where the physical facts hold, but phenomenal consciousness does not, which is sufficient to refute physicalism. This is where the sharpest contemporary objections bite. The type B materialist, the physicalist who accepts an epistemic gap but denies an ontological one, rejects the inference from primary conceivability to metaphysical possibility. They argue that the connection between the physical and the phenomenal is a posteriori necessary, like the connection between water and H2O. The zombie scenario is conceivable only because we cannot grasp the necessitation a priori, not because it represents a genuine possibility. Chalmers's two-dimensional framework was designed precisely to handle this objection. He argues that cases of a posteriori necessity like water and H2O are cases where primary and secondary intentions come apart. Twin Earth is primarily possible. There is a scenario matching the primary intention of water where the liquid is XYZ. But it is not secondarily possible because water is necessarily H2O. For the zombie case, Chalmers argues, there is no analogous gap between primary and secondary intentions for phenomenal concepts. The primary intention of pain picks out the same property as its secondary intention, namely the felt quality of pain. Phenomenal concepts are, in his terms, semantically stable. This claim about the semantic stability of phenomenal concepts is the crux of the entire debate. If Chalmers is right, then primary conceivability of zombies entails their genuine metaphysical possibility, and physicalism falls. If the type B materialist is right, then phenomenal concepts behave like natural kind concepts, with primary and secondary intentions that come apart, and the conceivability of zombies tells us nothing about what is genuinely possible. 30 years of debate have not settled this question, and some of the most technically sophisticated work in philosophy of mind in the 2020s continues to turn on it. Part 6. Physicalism's Best Defense, the Phenomenal Concept Strategy. The zombie argument and the knowledge argument both generate epistemic gaps between physical and phenomenal truths. The physicalist needs to explain why these gaps exist without conceding that they reflect gaps in nature. The phenomenal concept strategy named by Daniel Stoljar is the most systematic attempt to do this. The core idea is disarmingly simple. We possess a special class of concepts, phenomenal concepts, that refer to conscious experiences in a distinctive way. These concepts are conceptually isolated from all physical, functional, and theoretical concepts. There are no a priori connections between thinking about pain in phenomenal terms and thinking about it in neural terms. This isolation explains why Mary seems to learn something new, why zombies seem conceivable, and why there appears to be an explanatory gap without any of these requiring that consciousness is non-physical. Different proponents characterize phenomenal concepts in different ways, and the differences are not merely verbal. Brian Law and Peter Carruthers initially treated them as recognitional concepts, concepts that pick out their reference through a capacity to recognize instances from the first person. David Papineau treats them as quotational, concepts that literally contain or reactivate a token experience as part of their structure. Katalin Balog defends a constitutional account where token experiences serve as modes of presentation for the properties they instantiate. On any of these accounts, the strategy follows the same logical template. Step 1. Phenomenal concepts and physical concepts pick out the same properties. Step 2. The concepts are nevertheless cognitively distinct. They cannot be connected a priori. Step 3. This cognitive distinctness is fully explainable in physical terms. It arises from the distinctive way phenomenal concepts are formed, not from any non-physical property they track. If all three steps hold, the epistemic gaps are real but ontologically innocent. The strategy gained enormous traction through the 1990s and 2000s because it appeared to resolve the hard problem without denying the reality of phenomenal consciousness. Unlike Type A materialism, which denies there is any explanatory gap at all, the phenomenal concepts strategy grants the gap, but domesticates it. Unlike Type B materialism, in its blunter forms, it offers a specific mechanism, the peculiar nature of phenomenal concepts, for why the gap arises. Then Chalmers published a sweeping challenge in 2006 that many regard as the most serious threat the strategy has faced. His argument takes the form of a dilemma. Either the special features of phenomenal concepts can themselves be fully characterized in physical or functional terms, or they cannot. If they can be so characterized, then consider a zombie possessing phenomenal concepts with all the same physical and functional properties. The zombie will have concepts that are conceptually isolated from its physical concepts in exactly the same way yours are. The zombie will judge that it has an explanatory gap, will believe that consciousness is hard to explain, will insist that there is something it is like to see red. But the zombie is not conscious. So the phenomenal concept strategy predicts that the epistemic gaps would arise even in the absence of consciousness. This means the strategy cannot explain our epistemic situation with reference to consciousness, which was its entire point. If the special features of phenomenal concepts cannot be fully characterized in physical terms, then those features themselves point to something non-physical. The strategy was supposed to locate the gap in our concepts, not in the world. But if the concepts have features that resist physical explanation, the gap reappears at the level of the concepts themselves. The physicalist has not dissolved the problem, but merely relocated it. Defenders of the strategy have responded in several ways. Carruthers and Vele argue that Chalmers' dilemma rests on a particular account of what it means for two beings to share an epistemic situation, and that this account can be challenged. Balog's constitutional account tries to thread the needle by arguing that phenomenal concepts have features, their experiential constituents, that are physical, but that cannot be fully captured by a third-person characterization. This is meant to explain why the zombie's concepts would lack something yours have, even though both are physically constituted. The most recent challenge comes from Marcelino Botin's 2022 paper, which argues that the cognitive isolation of phenomenal concepts cannot actually explain our problem intuitions, the specific judgments we make about consciousness being hard to explain. The worry is that conceptual isolation explains why we cannot derive phenomenal facts from physical ones, but it does not explain why we positively judge that there is something left over. These are different explanatory targets, and the second is what the hard problem really demands. Chalmers himself has said he considers this debate close to a stalemate. The phenomenal concept strategy remains the best developed physicalist response to the hard problem. But whether it can survive the dilemma, and whether any version of the strategy can explain not just our conceptual gaps, but our strong conviction that consciousness poses a special problem, remains genuinely open. Part 7. Epiphenomenalism and the Causal Exclusion Problem. Every non-reductive position about consciousness faces a question that may be even harder than the hard problem. If conscious experience is something over and above the physical, what causal work does it do? Property dualism, the most common philosophical stance among those who take the hard problem seriously, holds that phenomenal properties are ontologically distinct from physical properties while depending on them. Phenomenal properties supervene on physical properties. There can be no change in consciousness without a corresponding change in the physical. But property dualism faces a dilemma about the direction of causation that is rarely presented at full strength. The causal exclusion argument, developed most rigorously by Jaegwon Kim, proceeds as follows. Take any physical event in the brain, say the neural activity that causes your hand to pull away from a hot stove. This event has a complete physical cause. Prior neural states, sensory signals, motor commands. Physics is causally closed. Every physical event has a sufficient physical cause. Now, suppose the phenomenal experience of pain is a distinct property from the neural activity that realizes it. The pain experience cannot cause the hand withdrawal, because the neural activity already provides a sufficient cause. Adding a phenomenal cause would mean the hand withdrawal is causally overdetermined, caused twice over by two independent factors. Systematic overdetermination of this kind, where every single physical event that has a mental cause also has a sufficient physical cause, is widely regarded as implausible. So the property dualist seems forced into epiphenomenalism, the view that conscious experience exists but does nothing. Your pain is real but causally inert. It rides along on top of the neural processing without influencing any behavior, any decision, any utterance. A graduate student late at night, wincing as she accidentally touches a hot pan and yanking her hand back, demonstrates the tension concretely. On the epiphenomenalist view, her wince, her pulling back, even her later saying, "that really hurt," are all caused entirely by neural events. The felt agony of the burn is a real property of her experience, but it causes nothing. It is a side effect of the neural processing, a shadow thrown by the physical without casting any shadow of its own. Most people find this incredible, and the objections go beyond mere incredulity. The most precise objection targets self-knowledge. If your phenomenal states have no causal power, then they cannot cause your beliefs about them. Your belief that you are in pain must be caused entirely by neural processes, not by the pain experience itself. But then it is an astonishing coincidence that your beliefs about your phenomenal states are reliably accurate. You believe you're in pain, and you are in pain. But the two facts are connected only by the neural processes underlying both, not by any causal link from experience to belief. This lucky coincidence problem is often presented as devastating, but epiphenomenalists have a reply that is stronger than it is given credit for. If phenomenal properties supervene on physical properties, and beliefs about phenomenal properties are caused by the very same physical properties that the phenomenal properties supervene on, then the correlation between your beliefs and your experiences is not a coincidence at all. It is guaranteed by the supervenience relation. Your neural states cause both your experience and your belief about your experience. The belief does not need to be caused by the experience in order to be about the experience. But this reply generates its own deep problem. If your beliefs about consciousness are fully explained by their neural causes, with no causal contribution from consciousness itself, then the reliability of those beliefs is accidental from the perspective of phenomenal truth. Your neural system is tracking neural properties, not phenomenal ones. The fact that phenomenal properties happen to supervene on the neural properties being tracked is, from the epistemic perspective, a structural coincidence rather than a genuine epistemic achievement. Interactionist dualism avoids epiphenomenalism by allowing consciousness to causally influence the physical, but this requires either violations of physical causal closure or a revision of our understanding of the physical. Neither option is scientifically respectable in its standard formulation, though some philosophers argue that quantum mechanics provides room for mental causation without violating conservation laws. Russellian monism, which will be discussed in a later part, attempts a different escape route by arguing that the causal exclusion argument rests on an impoverished conception of the physical. If physical properties have intrinsic natures that are themselves phenomenal or proto-phenomenal, then there is no exclusion problem, because the mental and the physical are not genuinely distinct. But this strategy has its own costs, which the combination problem will reveal. The causal exclusion problem remains the sharpest constraint on any non-reductive theory. Either consciousness does causal work within the physical order, or it is explanatorily idle, and neither option comes for free. Part 8. Functionalism and the absent Qualia challenge. Functionalism is not merely one theory of consciousness among many. It is the default framework of cognitive science, the assumption built into virtually every computational model of the mind. Understanding where it fails is therefore a matter of understanding the limits of the entire research program, not just one philosophical position. The central functionalist thesis is that mental states are individuated by their causal roles. Pain is not defined by what it is made of, neurons, silicon, or alien goo, but by what it does within the system. It is caused by tissue damage. It causes withdrawal behavior, distress vocalizations, and beliefs that something is wrong. Any system that instantiates the right causal role structure has the right mental states, regardless of its physical composition. This has an enormous advantage for the science of mind. It makes mental states substrate independent, which is why we can build computational models of cognition without worrying about whether the model is made of neurons or transistors. And it handles the multiple realizability problem elegantly. The same mental state can be realized in radically different physical systems. The absent qualia objection, developed most forcefully by Ned Block in 1978, challenges whether causal role is sufficient for phenomenal consciousness. Block asks us to consider the population of China, roughly 1 billion people, each given a two-way radio and instructions to simulate the functional organization of a single human brain. Each person plays the role of one neuron, receiving signals from others and transmitting signals according to the specified rules. The entire nation implements the same functional organization as your brain during a conscious experience. Block's intuition, which he marshals into an argument, is that the population of China would not be conscious. There would be nothing it is like to be this system, even though it has exactly the right functional organization. If this is correct, then functional organization is not sufficient for consciousness, and functionalism, at least in its strong form, is false. The standard functionalist reply is that the intuition is unreliable. We have no independent access to what it would be like to be the Chinese nation implementing a brain's functional organization. Our intuition that it lacks consciousness is driven by irrelevant features: its spatial distribution, its unfamiliar composition, its slowness. None of these features are relevant to whether the system instantiates the right causal role structure. This reply is correct as far as it goes, but it does not address the deeper version of the worry. The deeper version does not depend on intuitions about China, but on a structural feature of functional explanation. Functional characterizations are multiply realizable by definition. For any functional organization, there are, in principle, infinitely many physical systems that could realize it. Some of these realizers will be familiar, like neural tissue. Others will be deeply unfamiliar, like the national population, or a system of interconnected water pipes, or a lookup table etched in silicon. The question is not whether any particular unfamiliar realizer is conscious. The question is whether there is any principled way, within the functionalist framework, to distinguish conscious realizers from non-conscious ones. If consciousness is determined entirely by functional organization, then all realizers with the right organization must be conscious. If your intuition resists this, then you implicitly believe something beyond functional organization matters for consciousness. The most sophisticated contemporary functionalist response comes from Sidney Shoemaker, and more recently from the mechanistic functionalism developed by Gualtiero Piccinini. Shoemaker argues that absent qualia scenarios are not genuinely possible because any system that truly instantiates the right functional organization must also instantiate the relevant phenomenal properties. The appearance that you can pry them apart reflects a misdescription of the functional organization, not a genuine metaphysical possibility. Piccinini's mechanistic functionalism adds an important refinement. Not just any causal role counts as a functional role in the relevant sense. The roles must be implemented by genuine computational mechanisms operating on vehicles that carry information in the right way. This rules out many of Block's exotic realizers like lookup tables and homunculi-headed robots as not genuinely implementing the functional organization, but merely simulating it at a higher level of description. But this refinement raises its own question. If you constrain the relevant realizers to genuine computational mechanisms, you are adding conditions beyond bare functional organization. You are saying that the right kind of implementation matters, that not every causal role realizer is equal. But this is precisely what the absent qualia argument was designed to show, that functionalism in its pure form leaves something out and that the missing factor must be specified in non-functional terms. Whether mechanistic functionalism successfully answers this challenge or merely concedes the point in sophisticated clothing remains disputed. Part 9. Higher Order Theories of Consciousness. All the positions considered so far share an assumption that goes mostly unnoticed. They assume that a mental state is conscious if it has certain intrinsic properties, whether those properties are phenomenal, functional, or physical. Higher-order theories challenge this assumption at its root, proposing that consciousness is not a property of mental states themselves, but a relation between mental states. The motivating observation comes from an ordinary feature of mental life. You can be in a mental state without being aware that you are in it. During a long drive, you process enormous amounts of visual information, tracking lanes, adjusting speed, braking for hazards. Much of this processing is genuinely perceptual, involving complex representations of the road and other vehicles. But you can arrive at your destination with no memory of the drive, and, plausibly, no conscious experience of large portions of it. The first-order perceptual states were present, but consciousness was absent. This observation suggests a structural hypothesis. What makes a mental state conscious is not the state itself, but the fact that you are aware of being in that state. Consciousness arises when the mind takes itself as an object, when a higher-order state represents a lower-order state. David Rosenthal's higher-order thought theory and David Armstrong's earlier higher-order perception theory both elaborate this idea, though in importantly different ways. For Rosenthal, a mental state is conscious when it is the target of a simultaneous higher-order thought, a thought that represents you as being in that state. Your experience of red is conscious when you have a thought, roughly, of the form, I am seeing something red. This higher-order thought need not itself be conscious. It need not be articulate, deliberate, or linguistically structured. It need only be a cognitive state whose content is that you are in the relevant first-order state. The theory has a striking implication that many find counterintuitive, but that Rosenthal embraces. A first-order sensory state that is not targeted by any higher-order thought is not conscious at all, even though it may be rich in representational content. The visual processing during your highway drive was genuine perception, but it was not phenomenally conscious because no higher-order thought represented you as perceiving. Consciousness is not in the first-order state. It is conferred upon it by the higher-order representation. The most powerful objection, and the one that defenders find hardest to answer, concerns misrepresentation. If consciousness is constituted by higher-order representation, then the higher-order state can, in principle, misrepresent what is happening at the first-order level. You could have a higher-order thought representing yourself as seeing red when in fact no first-order red representation exists. On Rosenthal's theory, this state is conscious. You genuinely experience red, even though the relevant first-order state is absent. For many, this is an intolerable result. It implies that you can have a conscious experience of red without any perceptual state of red, purely through a misrepresenting higher-order thought. Rosenthal accepts this consequence and argues that it is empirically supported by certain neurological conditions and by the possibility of direct cortical stimulation bypassing sensory pathways. But opponents argue that it confuses causing an experience with constituting one. Richard Brown, working within the higher-order framework, has developed a more nuanced version that constrains misrepresentation. He argues that higher-order thoughts can generate conscious experiences that do not match any first-order state, but that this is no more problematic than perceptual illusions at the first-order level. Just as you can visually experience a straight stick as bent in water, you can consciously experience red through a misrepresenting higher-order thought. The result is a conscious experience that does not accurately represent your sensory state, but it is a genuine experience nonetheless. The empirical version of higher-order theory, developed by Hakuan Lau and collaborators, connects the philosophical framework to neuroscience by identifying the higher-order representations with prefrontal cortical activity. This makes specific predictions. Disrupting prefrontal activity should diminish consciousness even when sensory processing is intact. Evidence from studies of blindsight and from transcranial magnetic stimulation partially supports this, though the interpretation remains contested. But the deepest philosophical worry persists, regardless of empirical refinement. Higher-order theories explain consciousness in terms of one mental state representing another. But why does that relation produce subjective experience? Why is a system that represents its own states conscious, rather than merely informationally complex? The hard problem seems to reappear at the higher-order level. We still need an account of why higher-order representation generates phenomenality, and the theory as stated does not provide one. Rosenthal denies this is a problem, arguing that the question rests on an illicit assumption that consciousness must be intrinsic rather than relational. Whether this response is adequate or whether it merely pushes the mystery up one level is a dispute that remains very much alive. Part 10. First-order representationalism and the transparency thesis. Higher-order theories locate consciousness in the relation between mental states. First-order representationalism takes the opposite approach. Consciousness is fully determined by the content of first-order perceptual representations, with no need for any higher-order monitoring. The motivating observation is a phenomenological one, and it is surprisingly powerful once noticed. Try to attend to your visual experience of a red apple, not to the apple itself, but to the experience. Try to introspect the redness as a property of your experience, rather than a property of the apple. What you find, according to representationalists like Michael Tye and Fred Dretsky, is that you cannot do this. Every attempt to examine your experience passes through to the world. You see the apple's redness, not some inner property of your visual state. This is the transparency thesis. Experience is transparent to its representational content. When you introspect, you do not encounter qualia as intrinsic properties of experience. You encounter represented properties of the world. The redness is out there, on the apple, not in here, in your head. If transparency holds, then the qualitative character of experience is the representational content, and qualia, as traditionally conceived as intrinsic, non-representational features of experience, do not exist. Tye builds this into a systematic theory called panic, an acronym for poised, abstract, non-conceptual, intentional content. A mental state is phenomenally conscious when it carries content that is poised to influence beliefs and behavior, abstract enough to represent properties rather than particular objects, non-conceptual in that it does not require the subject to possess the relevant concepts, and intentional in that it is about something in the world. Every quale is identical to a certain kind of representational content, and there is nothing more to the phenomenal character of an experience than its panic content. This is an elegant and parsimonious theory. It brings consciousness within the scope of representational and computational explanation, making it continuous with the rest of cognitive science. It explains why experiences have the qualitative character they do, because they represent the specific properties they do. And it dissolves the hard problem by denying that there is a residual what it is like beyond the representational content. But the theory faces an objection that is structurally precise and has not been satisfactorily resolved. Consider two experiences that seem to have the same representational content but different phenomenal characters. A common candidate is the experience of seeing red and the experience of imagining red. Both represent redness. But seeing red and imagining red feel profoundly different. If qualitative character is just representational content, this difference should not exist. Tye responds that the contents are not the same. Seeing red involves a richer, more determinate representational content than imagining red, and this difference accounts for the phenomenal difference. This is plausible for the perception and imagination case, but the objection can be sharpened. Consider two possible visual systems that represent the same external properties, the same wavelengths with the same level of determinacy, but that are wired differently. If the representational content is identical, the phenomenal character should be identical. Yet it seems conceivable that the two systems could differ in what their experiences are like. The deeper challenge is the spectrum inversion scenario, long discussed in the literature but recently given new precision. Two subjects look at the same red apple under identical conditions. Their visual systems produce representations with the same content. Both represent the apple as having a certain surface reflectance property. But one experiences the characteristic hue we call red, while the other experiences what we call green. They would use the same colour words, make the same discriminations, agree on every behavioural and functional test. Yet their experiences differ. If spectrum inversion is possible, then representational content does not fix phenomenal character, and first-order representationalism is false. The standard representationalist defense is to deny the possibility of spectrum inversion by arguing that the inverted subject's representations would inevitably differ in content. If your visual system assigns the label red to a different set of reflectance properties than mine, then our representations do differ in content, and the apparent inversion is illusory. But this defense has a cost that is often understated. It requires that representational content is fine-grained enough to capture every phenomenal distinction, that there are no phenomenal differences without representational differences. This is an empirical commitment, not an a priori truth, and it is far from obvious that our best theories of mental content can deliver the required grain. The representationalist needs a theory of content that is simultaneously coarse enough to be scientifically tractable and fine enough to mirror the full structure of phenomenal experience. Whether any available theory of content can satisfy both demands simultaneously remains an open question at the frontier of the debate. Part 11. Access consciousness versus phenomenal consciousness. All the preceding parts have operated with an assumption that itself requires scrutiny, that we know what we mean by consciousness. Ned Block's 1995 distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness exposed an ambiguity that runs through the entire debate and that, once recognized, restructures it fundamentally. Access consciousness is defined functionally. A mental state is access conscious when its content is available for use by the cognitive system, available for verbal report, for reasoning, for the control of action. This is the sense of consciousness that matters for most of cognitive science and for everyday attributions of awareness. When a doctor asks whether the patient is conscious, she is asking about access. Can the patient respond, track stimuli, engage with the environment? Phenomenal consciousness is defined by subjectivity. A mental state is phenomenally conscious when there is something it is like to be in that state, when it has a qualitative character from the first-person perspective. This is the sense of consciousness that generates the hard problem. Access consciousness poses no deep philosophical puzzle. It is a matter of information flow, and information flow is the kind of thing computational models can handle. Phenomenal consciousness is what resists that treatment. Block's critical claim is that these two forms of consciousness can come apart. There can be phenomenal consciousness without access, and possibly access without phenomenal consciousness. If this is correct, it has enormous consequences for both philosophy and empirical research, because it means that studying the neural basis of access consciousness may tell us nothing about the neural basis of phenomenal consciousness. Consider a radiologist scanning a chest X-ray under time pressure. She glances at the image for 2 seconds and forms a clinical impression: probable pneumonia in the lower right lobe. If asked immediately, she can report this impression. But she may also have registered at some level a subtle nodule in the upper left that she does not mention, and perhaps cannot report if asked about it specifically. Was the nodule representation phenomenally conscious, but not access conscious? Or was it simply unconscious? Block argues that cases like this, and more rigorously controlled experimental cases, provide evidence that phenomenal consciousness can outstrip access. Phenomenal experience is richer than what the cognitive system can grab and report at any given moment. Access mechanisms are bottlenecks, not boundaries of consciousness. The opposing view, defended by cognitive scientists like Daniel Dennett and Stanislas Dehaene, is that the distinction is incoherent. On their account, there is no phenomenal consciousness apart from access. What Block calls phenomenal consciousness without access is simply unconscious processing that is mistakenly described as conscious because of a philosophical intuition that has no empirical support. If a mental state is not available for report or reasoning, there is no principled basis for calling it conscious at all. This disagreement is not merely terminological. It has direct consequences for how we study consciousness empirically. If Bloch is right, then experiments that use verbal report or button press as the measure of consciousness are systematically missing some conscious states. The neural correlates of consciousness identified by report-based paradigms would be the correlates of access, not of phenomenal consciousness per se. And the true neural correlate of phenomenal consciousness might lie earlier in the processing stream, in sensory cortex, rather than in the prefrontal areas associated with access and report. If Dehaene and Dennett are right, then there is no phenomenal consciousness to study beyond what access-based measures reveal, and the search for a separate neural basis of phenomenal experience is misguided. The hard problem itself dissolves, because the only consciousness worth explaining is access consciousness, which is a functional phenomenon amenable to standard scientific explanation. The empirical evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The Sperling paradigm, in which subjects report seeing more than they can recall, has been interpreted as evidence for overflow by Bloch and as evidence for rich unconscious representation by anti-overflow theorists. No experimental paradigm has yet been able to decisively settle whether phenomenal consciousness can exist without access, because every method for detecting consciousness ultimately relies on some form of access, and the question is precisely whether there is consciousness beyond what any access-based method can detect. This creates what some have called the methodological puzzle of consciousness research. The very tools we need to answer the question may be constitutively unable to reach the answer. Part 12. The Overflow Debate. The access versus phenomenal consciousness distinction generates a specific empirical prediction that has become one of the most actively contested questions in consciousness science. If phenomenal consciousness overflows access, then there should be cases where subjects are phenomenally conscious of more than they can report, attend to, or encode in working memory. The overflow debate is the attempt to test this prediction, and it reveals how deeply empirical methods are entangled with philosophical assumptions. The central piece of evidence is George Sperling's iconic memory paradigm from 1960. Subjects are briefly shown a grid of 12 letters, arranged in 3 rows of 4. When asked to report all the letters, they can reliably recall only 3 or 4. But when a tone cues them to report a specific row immediately after the display disappears, they can report almost any letter from that row. This suggests that more information was available than the subject could access through whole report. Bloch argues this demonstrates phenomenal overflow. All 12 letters were phenomenally conscious, the subject saw them all, but access mechanisms, limited to about 4 items, could not grab all of them for report. The richness of consciousness exceeds the bottleneck of cognitive access. The anti-overflow response, pressed by Dehaene and by Cohen and Dennett, is that the unreported letters were not conscious at all. They were maintained in a high-capacity sensory buffer, iconic memory, that is unconscious. The partial report queue does not reveal pre-existing consciousness of the queued row. It triggers a new act of conscious perception, pulling items from the unconscious buffer into access. On this view, subjects report seeing more than they can recall because they are confusing a vague sense of something was there with a detailed conscious perception that never occurred. The debate has sharpened considerably in the 2020s with new experimental evidence and philosophical analysis. One critical line of evidence uses attribute amnesia paradigms. Subjects attend to and process a single stimulus for several trials, performing a specific task on it. Then they are unexpectedly asked to report the stimulus's identity. Many cannot do so, even though they were fully attending to the stimulus, and it was clearly above the threshold for detection. This suggests that even attended supraliminal information can be phenomenally conscious yet fail to be reportable, which supports the overflow view. Opponents counter with evidence from inattentional blindness and change blindness. Subjects frequently fail to notice large changes in a visual scene or prominent unexpected objects when their attention is engaged elsewhere. Emily Ward has argued that these failures are not mere memory deficits, but genuine perceptual deficits. The subjects did not consciously see what they missed. If correct, this means phenomenology is much sparser than we think, undermining the intuition of rich overflow. The philosophical crux of the dispute is a methodological one that neither side can easily resolve. Bloch's overflow claim requires evidence of phenomenal consciousness without access. But every piece of evidence for consciousness is itself a form of access, a report, a behavioral response, a neural signature that correlates with reportable states. The anti-overflow theorist can always argue that the evidence shows access, not phenomenal consciousness beyond access. And the overflow theorist can always argue that absence of access does not prove absence of phenomenal consciousness. This methodological impasse has led some researchers to conclude that the overflow question may be empirically undecidable, not because the answer does not exist, but because the available methods are constitutively unable to distinguish between the competing hypotheses. Others, like Victor Lame, have proposed that we should identify phenomenal consciousness with recurrent processing in visual cortex, which would provide a neural criterion independent of access. But this proposal presupposes a particular theory of the neural basis of consciousness, and choosing that theory already takes a side in the philosophical debate. The overflow question thus sits at the precise intersection where empirical research meets philosophical assumptions, and neither discipline can resolve it alone. Part 13. Attention and consciousness. Do they come apart? The overflow debate asks whether consciousness exceeds access. A closely related but distinct question asks whether consciousness exceeds attention. These are different questions because attention and access are not the same thing, and conflating them has generated significant confusion in the empirical literature. Attention is a selection mechanism. It amplifies some representations and suppresses others, filtering the vast stream of sensory information into a manageable set for further processing. Access consciousness involves availability for report and reasoning. The standard assumption in much of cognitive science has been that attention is the gateway to consciousness. Only attended stimuli become conscious, and unattended stimuli remain unconscious. Jesse Prinz has defended this tight coupling most explicitly. On his view, attention is necessary and sufficient for phenomenal consciousness. Consciousness just is attended intermediate-level representation in the sensory systems. This connects consciousness to a well-studied empirical mechanism and makes it scientifically tractable in a way that more diffuse theories do not. But several lines of evidence suggest that attention and consciousness can dissociate. Robert Kentridge and colleagues studied patients with blindsight, the neurological condition in which patients with damage to primary visual cortex report no conscious experience in a portion of their visual field yet can respond to stimuli presented there at above chance levels. Critically, these patients show attentional effects in their blind field. Their response times to stimuli in the blind field are modulated by spatial cues in the same way as in the intact field. This suggests that attention can operate without consciousness. The stimulus is attended but not consciously experienced. The opposite dissociation, consciousness without attention, is more controversial. The key evidence comes from dual task paradigms, where subjects perform an attention-demanding central task, while stimuli appear in the periphery. Certain properties of the peripheral stimuli, particularly their gist or categorical identity, can be discriminated even when attention is fully occupied by the central task. Lee and colleagues showed that subjects could categorize natural scenes presented in the periphery while performing a demanding letter discrimination task at fixation. Bloch and others have argued that these peripheral discriminations reflect genuinely conscious perception without focused attention. The counter-argument, pressed by Cohen, Dennett and others, is that these experiments do not show consciousness without attention. They show consciousness with distributed or diffuse attention, which is a different claim. Even during an attention-demanding central task, some attentional resources leak to the periphery. The peripheral discriminations may reflect this residual attention rather than a form of consciousness that operates independently of attention altogether. Christoph Koch and Naotsugu Tsuchiya proposed a taxonomy that separates the question more cleanly. They distinguish between top-down attention, the voluntary allocation of processing resources, and consciousness as a phenomenal state. On their account, it is possible to have top-down attention without consciousness, as in blindsight, and consciousness without top-down attention, as in certain peripheral experiences and pop-out phenomena. But this does not settle whether some form of attention, perhaps a more primitive, bottom-up or stimulus-driven form, is required for consciousness in all cases. This question matters for the Neural Correlates of Consciousness Research program. If attention and consciousness are dissociable, then the neural correlates of attention, primarily in frontoparietal networks, may be distinct from the neural correlates of consciousness, which might instead lie in sensory cortex. If they are inseparable, then the search for consciousness should focus on the attentional networks themselves. Current evidence supports a partial dissociation. Attention and consciousness are closely linked, but not identical, with the precise nature of the link remaining one of the most productive open questions in both philosophy and cognitive neuroscience. Part 14. Blindsight, Dissociations, and what Pathology reveals. Theoretical arguments about the structure of consciousness often reach an impasse where competing positions seem equally defensible on conceptual grounds alone. Neurological pathology provides a natural experiment that can break such impasses, not because brain damage settles philosophical questions, but because it reveals dissociations between capacities that theory assumes go together. Blindsight is the most philosophically important of these dissociations. Patients with destruction of primary visual cortex, area V1, report complete blindness in the corresponding portion of their visual field. They insist they see nothing. Yet, when forced to guess the location, orientation, or colour of stimuli presented in the blind field, they perform well above chance, sometimes approaching normal accuracy. Patient DB, studied extensively by Lawrence Weisskranz beginning in the 1970s, could reach accurately toward objects he insisted he could not see and discriminate the orientation of gratings presented in his scotoma. The philosophical significance is immediate. Blindsight appears to be a case of visual processing without visual experience, perception without phenomenal consciousness. If this is correct, it demonstrates that the functional capacities of vision, discrimination, localization, and even certain forms of categorization can be decoupled from the subjective experience of seeing. This supports the claim that phenomenal consciousness is something over and above the functional processing, exactly what the hard problem predicts. But the interpretation is contested at a precise point. Some researchers, including Weisskranz himself in later work, noted that blindsight patients sometimes report vague feelings or impressions in the blind field, what has been called blindsight type 2. These patients do not see in the normal sense, but they have some dim awareness that something is present. If this dim awareness counts as phenomenal consciousness, however degraded, then blindsight does not demonstrate a clean dissociation between processing and experience. It may instead demonstrate that damage to V1 degrades experience rather than eliminating it entirely. This matters for the debate between first-order and higher-order theories. On the first-order representationalist view, consciousness is determined by the content of first-order perceptual representations. Since blindsight patients retain first-order visual representations, the theory must explain why these representations are not conscious. The usual answer is that the representations are degraded, lacking the richness or determinacy required for phenomenal consciousness. But this is ad hoc unless there is an independent criterion for how rich a representation must be. On the higher-order theory, the explanation is more natural. V1 damage disrupts the pathway by which sensory representations reach the prefrontal areas that generate higher-order thoughts. Without higher-order representation of the sensory state, the state is not conscious, even though it continues to influence behavior. Blindsight is exactly what the higher-order theory predicts. Intact first-order processing, disrupted higher-order monitoring, and the result is visual processing without visual experience. Unilateral spatial neglect provides a different kind of dissociation. Patients with right parietal damage fail to attend to or report stimuli on their left side. Unlike blindsight patients, neglect patients are not blind. Their visual cortex is intact. When their attention is directed to the neglected side, they can often see stimuli normally. But in spontaneous behavior, the left side of space simply does not exist for them. They eat food only from the right side of their plate, draw clocks with all the numbers on one side, and deny that anything is wrong. The philosophical interest of neglect lies in what it reveals about the relationship between consciousness and attention. Neglect patients have intact visual processing on the neglected side, the information reaches visual cortex, but they lack conscious access to it. This supports the view that attention is necessary for consciousness, since the breakdown is specifically attentional. But it also raises a harder question. Do neglect patients have phenomenal experience of the neglected side that they cannot access? Or do they genuinely lack experience entirely? There is evidence pointing in both directions. Some neglect patients show semantic priming from stimuli on the neglected side, meaning the stimulus was processed to the level of meaning even though the patient has no conscious awareness of it. Others show emotional responses to neglected stimuli, suggesting unconscious affective processing. Whether any of this processing is accompanied by phenomenal experience that the patient cannot report is once again the overflow question in clinical form. Split brain cases, where the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres is severed, raise yet another dimension of the problem. When a stimulus is presented to the right hemisphere of a split brain patient, the left hemisphere, which controls speech, cannot report it. But the right hemisphere can guide the left hand to select the correct object from an array. Is the right hemisphere conscious of the stimulus it cannot verbally report? If so, are there two conscious subjects in a single skull? Each of these clinical cases enforces a constraint on theories of consciousness, but none of them settles the fundamental questions. Blindsight constrains the relationship between processing and experience. Neglect constrains the relationship between attention and consciousness. Split brain constrains the relationship between consciousness and unity. Together, they show that the capacities we ordinarily bundle under the single word consciousness can come apart along multiple dimensions simultaneously. Any adequate theory must explain not just consciousness as a whole, but the specific ways in which it fractures when the brain is damaged. And this explanatory demand has proven far more constraining than any thought experiment. Part 15. Neural Correlates of Consciousness as a Research Program. Before examining the major empirical theories of consciousness, the research program that generated them needs philosophical scrutiny. The search for neural correlates of consciousness, NCCs, has been the dominant empirical strategy for 3 decades. But the program rests on assumptions that are rarely examined and that determine what it can and cannot discover. An NCC, as defined by Chalmers in 2000, is a minimal neural system sufficient for a given conscious experience. The definition sounds straightforward, but each word in it conceals a decision point. Minimal means we are looking for the tightest possible neural correlate, stripping away everything not strictly necessary. Sufficient means the neural system is enough by itself, given normal background conditions, to produce the experience. Conscious experience means phenomenal consciousness, the subjective what it is like, not merely access or reportability. The program's practical methodology, however, typically relies on contrastive analysis. Researchers compare conditions where a stimulus is consciously perceived with conditions where the same stimulus is present but not consciously perceived, as in binocular rivalry or masking paradigms. The neural difference between these conditions is identified as the NCC. A radiologist reviewing 2 brain scans side by side, one from a trial where the patient reported seeing the face and one where the same face was presented but not seen, isolates the neural activation that tracks conscious perception. The philosophical problem is that this method presupposes what it is trying to discover. To contrast conscious perception with unconscious processing, the experimenter must already have a criterion for when the subject is conscious of the stimulus. That criterion is almost always a behavioral report. The subject presses a button, says a word, makes a discrimination response. But report is a measure of access consciousness, not necessarily of phenomenal consciousness. If Bloch is right that phenomenal consciousness overflows access, then report-based paradigms systematically miss some NCCs. They identify the neural correlates of reportability, not of experience as such. This methodological concern is not abstract. It maps directly onto a live disagreement about where in the brain consciousness resides. Report-based paradigms consistently implicate prefrontal and parietal cortices, because these are the regions involved in attention, working memory, and verbal report. But theories like recurrent processing theory, defended by Victor Lam, argue that phenomenal consciousness arises much earlier, in recurrent loops within sensory cortex itself, and that prefrontal involvement reflects the access and report mechanisms, not consciousness per se. The no-report paradigms, developed in the 2010s and 2020s, attempt to address this by finding neural signatures of consciousness without requiring the subject to report. These paradigms use, within state designs, physiological measures, or post-hoc sorting, to identify consciousness-related neural activity independent of the act of reporting. Early results suggest that removing the report requirement weakens the case for prefrontal involvement and strengthens the case for posterior sensory cortex. But interpreting these results still requires a theory of what counts as consciousness, which means the philosophical question cannot be separated from the empirical one, even by methodological innovation. The NCC program also faces a deeper conceptual limitation. Even if we identify the perfect neural correlate, we have a correlation, not an explanation. We know that activating this neural population is accompanied by this experience, but we do not know why. This is the explanatory gap revisited at the empirical level. Correlation tracks the hard problem without solving it. The NCC program, by its own design, can tell us which neural states correspond to conscious experiences, but cannot tell us what it is about those states that makes them conscious rather than merely information-bearing. The empirical theories that follow are attempts to go beyond mere correlation and provide that deeper account. Part 16. Global Neuronal Workspace Theory. Global Neuronal Workspace Theory, developed by Bernard Baars and elaborated by Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux, is the most empirically successful theory of consciousness to date in terms of experimental predictions confirmed. It is also the theory that most directly identifies consciousness with access, which makes it either elegantly parsimonious or deeply incomplete, depending on your philosophical commitments. The motivating observation is that the brain processes vast amounts of information in parallel, in specialized modular systems that operate independently. Visual processing, auditory processing, motor planning, language comprehension each proceed in their own neural territory, without any central executive monitoring them. Most of this processing is unconscious. A content becomes conscious on this theory when it gains access to a global workspace, a distributed network of neurons, primarily in prefrontal and parietal cortex, that broadcasts the content to multiple other systems simultaneously. The metaphor Baars originally used is a theatre. The vast audience sits in darkness, each member processing information locally. A spotlight illuminates a small area of the stage. Whatever is in the spotlight, the contents of the global workspace, is broadcast to the entire audience at once. Consciousness is the spotlight. It is the mechanism by which a single piece of content is made available to the whole cognitive system. Dehaene and Changeux gave this metaphor neural substance. The workspace is implemented by long-range cortical neurons, especially in prefrontal and parietal areas that form reciprocal connections with sensory and association cortices. When a sensory representation reaches a threshold of activation, it triggers ignition, a sudden, self-sustaining burst of activity that broadcasts the representation across the workspace network. This ignition has a distinctive neural signature, a late, sustained, widespread cortical activation. The P3B event-related potential being its most reliably measured marker. The theory has produced a striking set of confirmed predictions. It predicts that conscious perception should involve a sudden non-linear transition from unconscious to conscious processing, and masking experiments confirm this all-or-none pattern. It predicts that subliminal stimuli should activate sensory cortex without triggering workspace ignition, and neuroimaging confirms this dissociation. It predicts that the workspace should have limited capacity, that only one content can occupy it at a time, and behavioral evidence for the attentional blink and related bottlenecks supports this. The philosophical limitation is equally precise. Global workspace theory is, by design, a theory of access consciousness. It explains when and how contents become globally available for report, reasoning, and flexible behavioral control. It does not, and does not claim to, explain why global broadcasting should be accompanied by phenomenal experience. A sophisticated information processing system could broadcast contents to multiple subsystems without anything it is like occurring. The theory tells us what consciousness does, not why it exists. Dehaene has argued that this limitation is not a limitation at all, that once you have fully explained access, there is no residual phenomenal consciousness to explain. On this view, the hard problem is an illusion generated by our introspective habits, and a complete account of the neural mechanisms of access is a complete account of consciousness. This is a substantive philosophical commitment, not an empirical finding, and it places global workspace theory squarely on one side of the access versus phenomenal consciousness debate. The Templeton Foundation's adversarial collaboration, whose final results were published in Nature in 2025, tested competing predictions of global workspace theory against integrated information theory. None of the pre-registered predictions of global workspace theory passed the agreed-upon threshold, while 2 of 3 IIT predictions did. The results have been interpreted in different ways by different camps, and the workspace theory's defenders argue the experimental paradigms did not adequately test their theory's core claims. But the results have intensified the debate about whether a purely access-based theory can account for what consciousness research needs to explain. Part 17. Integrated Information Theory and its Axioms. Where global workspace theory starts from the function consciousness performs, integrated information theory starts from the opposite direction, from the structure of experience itself. Giulio Tononi's theory is built on the claim that a theory of consciousness should begin not with the brain, but with the properties of experience, and then ask what physical systems could implement those properties. IIT begins with what it calls axioms, though they function more as phenomenological postulates than as self-evident truths in the mathematical sense. The first is intrinsicality. Experience exists for the system itself, not merely as described by an external observer. The second is composition. Experience has structure. It is composed of multiple distinguishable components. The third is information. Each experience is the specific experience it is, differing from all other possible experiences. The fourth is integration. Experience is unified. It cannot be decomposed into independent sub-experiences without losing something essential. The fifth is exclusion. Each experience is definite, occurring at a particular grain and scale rather than at all possible levels simultaneously. From these axioms, the theory derives postulates about what physical systems must be like to generate consciousness. The central measure is integrated information, denoted by the Greek letter phi, which quantifies how much a system's causal structure exceeds the sum of its parts. A system with high phi is one whose parts are so interdependent that the whole system specifies a cause-effect structure that no partition into independent subsystems can replicate. On the theory, phi is consciousness. The quantity of integrated information equals the quantity of conscious experience. The theory's most striking and controversial consequences follow directly from its premises. Because phi is defined in terms of causal structure, not biological composition, any system with sufficiently high integrated information would be conscious, including potentially non-biological systems. More controversially, because simple physical systems like thermostats and photodiodes have non-zero integrated information, they would have non-zero consciousness. IIT implies a form of panpsychism in which consciousness is graded and ubiquitous, present in any system whose whole exceeds the causal power of its parts. This is where the theory has attracted the most forceful criticism. Scott Aaronson, the computer scientist, showed that certain simple feed-forward networks can have extremely high phi, despite having a structure that seems intuitively unconscious. A grid of XOR gates with no feedback, no recurrence, no complexity of the kind we associate with minds can be designed to maximize phi. If such a system is conscious, according to IIT, many critics argue the theory's measure has come apart from its intended target. IIT 4.0, published in 2023, introduced significant refinements to address these and other technical concerns. The updated formalism provides a more precise account of how a system's cause-effect structure is unfolded, with new measures of intrinsic information that better capture the postulates. The refinements narrow the class of systems that qualify as having high integrated information, potentially excluding some of Aronson's counterexamples. But the fundamental commitments remain. Consciousness is identical with integrated information, and this identity is a matter of ontology, not just correlation. The September 2023 open letter, signed by over 100 consciousness researchers calling IIT unfalsifiable pseudoscience, brought the controversy into the public sphere. The charge rests on two claims: that IIT's core identity between phi and consciousness is a metaphysical postulate not amenable to empirical test, and that the theory's predictions about non-human consciousness, such as the claim that inactive cerebellar tissue is unconscious, while the thalamocortical system is conscious, rest on the same postulate rather than independent evidence. A 2025 commentary in Nature Neuroscience reiterated these concerns. Defenders of IIT respond that the theory is falsifiable in principle, that specific empirical predictions about the location and structure of conscious substrates in the brain can be tested and potentially refuted. Tononi and collaborators argue that the pseudoscience accusation conflates metaphysical ambition with empirical emptiness. The theory's axioms may be philosophical starting points, but the predictions derived from them are genuinely empirical. Whether this defense is adequate turns on whether one accepts that a theory's metaphysical foundations can be insulated from falsification, while its derived predictions remain testable. This is itself a contested question in the philosophy of science, which means the debate over IIT is simultaneously a debate over the methodology of consciousness research as a whole. Part 18. Predictive Processing and Consciousness. Both global workspace theory and IIT treat consciousness as something to be explained at a single level, either as a global broadcasting function or as an information-theoretic quantity. Predictive processing approaches take a different structural strategy, treating consciousness as emerging from the brain's most fundamental computational operation, the ongoing prediction of sensory input. The predictive processing framework, developed by Carl Friston and applied to consciousness most explicitly by Anil Seth and Jacob Howe, holds that the brain is essentially a prediction machine. It constructs a hierarchical generative model of the world and constantly generates top-down predictions about incoming sensory signals. When predictions match input, the system stays in its current state. When they fail, the resulting prediction error propagates upward, forcing the model to update. Perception on this account is not the passive receipt of sensory data, but the active construction of the brain's best guess about what is causing its sensory input. Seth's specific contribution has been to argue that conscious experience is a form of controlled hallucination. The brain does not directly access the world. It infers the most probable causes of its sensory states using its generative model. When the model is well calibrated, the hallucination is controlled, meaning it tracks the environment reliably. When it is miscalibrated, as in psychedelic states, dreaming or psychosis, the controlled aspect breaks down and experiences diverge from reality. The framework makes specific claims about what determines the content of consciousness at any moment. It is whatever the brain's generative model currently infers as the most probable cause of incoming signals, weighted by precision, the brain's estimate of how reliable those signals are. Attention, on this account, is precision weighting. Attending to something is increasing the brain's confidence in certain prediction errors, allowing them to update the model more forcefully. Seth extends this framework to explain not just perceptual consciousness, but also interoceptive consciousness, the experience of the body from within. He argues that the self, the sense of being a particular embodied subject, is itself a prediction, the brain's best model of the causes of its interoceptive signals, its heartbeat, its breathing, its gut activity. This beast-machine view proposes that the most fundamental form of consciousness is not world-directed perception, but the organism's ongoing inference about its own physiological state. The framework has significant empirical traction. It provides accounts of anesthesia as a disruption of the brain's ability to update its generative model, of psychedelic states as a flattening of the model's precision weighting, and of dissociative conditions as a breakdown of the interoceptive self-model. Each of these accounts makes specific, testable neural predictions, and several have been partially confirmed. But the philosophical question that haunts predictive processing as a theory of consciousness is the same one that haunts global workspace theory. Even granting that the brain constructs a generative model, that prediction errors propagate, that precision is weighted, why does any of this give rise to experience? A well-functioning predictive processing system could, in principle, operate entirely in the dark, making excellent inferences about its sensory causes without there being anything it is like to undergo those inferences. The hard problem reappears at the level of the predictive model itself. Seth and Howe are aware of this limitation and have taken different stances toward it. Howe has suggested that predictive processing, precisely because it is not itself a theory of consciousness, could serve as a neutral framework within which different theories of consciousness, including IIT and global workspace theory, could be compared and empirically tested. Seth has been more ambitious, arguing that the predictive processing framework, combined with the right account of interoceptive inference and bodily regulation, may eventually dissolve rather than solve the hard problem, by showing that the problem rests on a mistaken assumption about the gap between prediction and reality. Whether either approach succeeds depends on whether a computational framework, however powerful, can genuinely bridge the divide between processing and experience, and the field has not reached consensus on whether this bridge is even the right kind of structure to build. Part 19. Quantum Approaches to Consciousness. Among consciousness researchers, quantum approaches occupy an unusual position, widely dismissed within mainstream philosophy and neuroscience, yet persistently revived by serious physicists and mathematicians who argue that the dismissal is premature. The central claim uniting these approaches is that the classical physics framework is inadequate to explain consciousness, and that some feature of quantum mechanics, superposition, entanglement or measurement, is essential. The most developed proposal is Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's orchestrated objective reduction theory. Penrose's starting point is a mathematical argument. Human mathematical understanding, particularly our ability to grasp the truth of certain Gödelian statements that no formal system can prove, shows that the mind operates non-computably. That is, the mind does something that no Turing machine can replicate. Since quantum mechanics involves processes, particularly wave-function collapse, that may be non-computable, Penrose argues that consciousness must involve quantum mechanical processes in the brain. Hameroff provides the biological substrate. He proposes that quantum superpositions occur within microtubules, protein structures inside neurons, and that orchestrated collapse of these superpositions, triggered by quantum gravity effects at the Planck scale, constitutes a moment of conscious experience. Each such collapse is a discrete event of proto-consciousness, and the stream of consciousness is a sequence of these events. The theory faces formidable objections on multiple fronts. The biological objection, pressed by Max Tegmark among others, is that the brain is far too warm and noisy for quantum coherence to be maintained at the relevant timescales. Decoherence, The process by which quantum superpositions collapse into classical states through interaction with their environment should occur in femtoseconds in biological tissue at body temperature. The timescales required for orchestrated objective reduction are orders of magnitude longer. Hameroff and Penrose have responded by pointing to evidence of long-lived quantum coherence in biological systems, particularly in photosynthetic complexes, where quantum effects appear to persist at physiological temperatures far longer than simple thermal models predict. Whether these findings translate to neuronal microtubules is an open empirical question, but the categorical claim that quantum coherence cannot occur in biological systems has been weakened. The philosophical objection is more fundamental. Even granting quantum processes in microtubules, it is entirely unclear why wave function collapse should generate conscious experience. The theory replaces one mystery with another. Instead of asking why neural computation produces consciousness, we are asked to accept that quantum gravity collapse produces consciousness, with no more explanatory transparency in the second case than the first. The hard problem reappears at the quantum level with equal force. The Gödelian argument that motivates Penrose's entire project has also been challenged on logical grounds. The argument depends on the claim that human mathematicians can see the truth of unprovable Gödel sentences, which shows they transcend formal systems. But this claim is contested. We do not see the truth of Gödel sentences directly, but infer it from the assumption that the formal system is consistent, and that assumption is itself not proven within the system. Our Gödelian abilities may therefore be entirely consistent with computability. A more recent quantum approach, by Gambini and Pullin in 2024, argues that many objections to Panpsychism's combination problem rest on assumptions derived from classical physics about supervenience. At the quantum level, exponentially many emergent properties and states arise from combinations of simpler systems, which may dissolve the classical difficulty of explaining how micro-experiences combine into macro-experiences. This is speculative but suggestive, and it illustrates how quantum approaches continue to evolve rather than standing still. The mainstream view remains that quantum effects are unlikely to play a constitutive role in consciousness, but the minority position is neither incoherent nor scientifically impossible, and its standing depends on empirical discoveries about quantum biology that have not yet been made. Part 20. Panpsychism and Russellian Monism. Every position examined so far faces at least one of two problems. Physicalism must explain why objective physical descriptions seem to leave out subjective experience. Dualism must explain how a non-physical mind interacts with the physical world. Panpsychism and its close relative Russellian monism attempt to dissolve both problems simultaneously by reconceiving what the physical world is. The argument's starting point is a feature of physics itself, first identified by Bertrand Russell in 1927. Physics describes the world entirely in terms of structural and relational properties: mass, charge, spin, spatio-temporal location. It tells us what matter does, how it behaves, what equations it satisfies. It says nothing about what matter is intrinsically, what occupies the nodes of the structural web. Physics, as Russell put it, is structurally rich but intrinsically silent. This generates what is now called the Russell gap. Physical theory describes the causal structure of the world, but every structure requires something to be structured. There must be intrinsic properties, properties that are not merely relational, that ground the structural relations physics describes. Physics does not tell us what these intrinsic properties are. Russellian monism proposes that the intrinsic properties underlying physical structure are phenomenal or proto-phenomenal in nature. Matter is, in itself, experiential. What physics describes from the outside as mass, charge, and their interactions are, from the inside, forms of experience or proto-experience. On this view, there is only one kind of substance, hence monism, and its intrinsic nature is experiential, though its structural features are what physics captures. The position has a specific attraction that distinguishes it from both physicalism and dualism. It avoids the hard problem because consciousness is not being generated by something fundamentally non-experiential. There is no mysterious emergence, no point at which dead matter suddenly lights up with experience. Consciousness is there from the start, built into the fabric of reality. And it avoids the interaction problem of dualism because there is no second substance. The experiential properties are the very intrinsic properties that ground physical structure, so they are already within the causal order. Philip Goff and Hedda Hassel-Moch have developed contemporary versions of panpsychism that clarify the position's logical space. Goff distinguishes between constitutive panpsychism, where macro-level consciousness is constituted by the micro-level consciousness of fundamental particles, and emergent panpsychism, where macro-level consciousness emerges from micro-level consciousness in ways that do not hold for ordinary physical emergence. He also distinguishes between panpsychism proper, where fundamental entities are conscious, and pan-proto-psychism, where fundamental entities have proto-phenomenal properties, properties that are not themselves experiences, but that ground experiences when combined in the right way. Chalmers has called Russellian panpsychism the most promising approach to the mind-body problem. It occupies a genuine gap in the logical space that other positions leave unfilled. But its promise comes with a price that is by now well anticipated in the literature: the combination problem. If electrons and quarks have micro-experiences, how do billions of micro-experiences combine to form the unified, rich, structured macro-experience of a human being? This problem has been called the hard problem of panpsychism, and it threatens to be just as intractable as the hard problem it was designed to avoid. Part 21. The combination problem. William James identified the core difficulty in 1890. Take 100 feelings, shut each in its own skin, windowless and private, and pack them together however you like. No additional experience arises from the collection. The 100 feelings remain 100 feelings, each isolated, none combining into a 101st experience that encompasses them all. Chalmers provided a systematic taxonomy of the combination problem in 2016, dividing it into 3 sub-problems that are distinct but interconnected. The subject combination problem asks how micro-subjects of experience, the experiences at the fundamental level, combine to form macro-subjects like you and me. The quality combination problem asks how micro-qualities, the qualitative characters of micro-experiences, combine to yield the rich qualitative space of human experience with its colours, sounds, emotions and spatial structure. The palette problem, a subspecies of the quality combination problem, asks how the impoverished palette of micro-level qualities could give rise to the vast phenomenal palette of macro-level experience. The subject combination problem is widely regarded as the most severe. Consider two adjacent neurons, each with its own micro-experience. When they fire together, forming a functional unit, there is supposed to be a new, combined subjective experience. But what kind of combination could produce a new subject? Physical combination puts things spatially together. Functional combination creates causal links between components. Neither kind of combination seems capable of producing a new locus of subjectivity, a new point of view that was not there before. Philip Goff has pressed this with particular force, arguing that experiences do not sum. There is no operation on subjects that yields a new subject in the way that addition on numbers yields a new number. Subjectivity seems to be a category that does not admit of composition. You cannot build a perspective by combining other perspectives because a perspective is not the kind of thing that has parts. Several strategies for addressing the combination problem have been developed. Sam Coleman's neutral monism abandons microsubjects while retaining micro-qualities. On his view, the fundamental level has phenomenal qualities but no subjects. Subjects emerge only at the macro level. This avoids subject combination by denying that there are micro-subjects to combine. But it faces the objection that phenomenal qualities without a subject to experience them are incoherent. Goff's own phenomenal bonding proposal posits a special relation between micro-subjects that constitutes macro-subjectivity. When micro-experiences stand in the phenomenal bonding relation, a new composite subject arises whose experience is constituted by but not identical to the experiences of the micro-subjects. The problem is that phenomenal bonding is postulated to do exactly the work that needs to be explained. It names the relation without illuminating how it operates or why it produces unified experience. Cosmopsychism, defended by Itai Shani and others, takes the opposite approach. Instead of building macro-consciousness from micro-experiences, it starts with a single cosmic subject whose experience is the totality of reality. Individual human consciousness is then a derivative, a restriction or aspect of the cosmic subject's experience, rather than something composed from below. This elegantly avoids the combination problem by inverting it. The question is no longer how micro-experiences combine into macro-experience, but how a unified cosmic experience gives rise to apparently separate individual experiences. Cosmopsychism faces its own decomposition problem, essentially the combination problem in reverse, but some panpsychists find this more tractable. Nino Cadic's 2024 proposal of monadic panpsychism takes yet another approach, inspired by Leibniz. It accepts that the subject combination problem cannot be solved and proposes instead a version of panpsychism that avoids combination entirely, using relational rather than compositional explanation. Micro-subjects constitute but do not combine into macro-experiences. Whether this distinction bears the weight placed on it remains to be evaluated. The combination problem has no widely accepted solution, and the panpsychist community acknowledges this with unusual candor. The honest assessment is that panpsychism trades the hard problem for the combination problem, and it is not yet clear which is more tractable. The combination problem may be the most important open question in the philosophy of consciousness, because if it can be solved, panpsychism becomes an extremely attractive position. And if it cannot, the most promising alternative to physicalism is in serious trouble. Part 22. Illusionism and Eliminativism about consciousness. Every position discussed so far shares a common assumption, that phenomenal consciousness is real and in need of explanation. Illusionism denies this assumption at its root. The view, most systematically defended by Keith Frankish, holds that phenomenal consciousness as traditionally conceived, with its ineffable, intrinsic, private, directly apprehended qualitative properties, does not exist. What exists is a set of representations that misrepresent their own nature. Introspection tells us that our experiences have phenomenal properties, but introspection is wrong. The task for a theory of consciousness is not to explain phenomenal properties, but to explain why we systematically believe we have them. The argument has a specific structure that distinguishes it from crude eliminativism. Frankish does not deny that we have experiences. He denies that our experiences have the special properties that philosophers call phenomenal, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, understood as intrinsic, non-functional, non-representational qualities. What we actually have are complex physical states that our introspective mechanisms represent as having these special properties, much as a computer desktop represents complex machine processes as colourful icons and folders. Dennett's comparison to a user interface is apt. The interface is real, the icons are real representations, but the properties they appear to have, their apparent simplicity and self-contained nature, do not correspond to anything in the underlying system. Gale and Strawson famously called this the silliest claim ever made. The objection has rhetorical force, but also a precise philosophical form. If illusionism claims that the painfulness of pain is an illusion, then who or what is experiencing the illusion? An illusion of pain is still an experience, and that experience has phenomenal character, namely the character of seeming to be in pain. So the illusion itself instantiates the very thing it is supposed to explain away. Frankish's response distinguishes between the strong and weak versions of illusionism. Weak illusionism holds that phenomenal properties exist, but are misrepresented by introspection as having features they lack, such as being ineffable or intrinsic. Strong illusionism holds that the properties introspection attributes to experience, the specifically phenomenal properties, simply do not exist. The experience of seeming to be in pain is a real physical state, but its phenomenal character, as traditionally conceived, is a fiction of introspective representation. The objection that an illusion of experience is still an experience is answered by noting that not all illusions instantiate what they represent. A visual illusion of a bent stick does not require a bent stick. Analogously, an introspective representation that attributes phenomenal redness to an experience does not require that the experience actually has phenomenal redness. The experience has complex physical properties that the introspective system represents as phenomenal properties, just as the straight stick has physical properties that the visual system represents as bentness. Graziano's attention schema theory, published in expanded illusionist form in 2024, provides a specific mechanistic proposal. The brain constructs an internal model of its own attentional processes, an attention schema that represents attention as a non-physical essence, a subjective awareness that floats free of mechanism. This model is useful for predicting and controlling attention, just as a body schema is useful for predicting and controlling movement. But the model is inaccurate in a specific way. It represents attention as having phenomenal properties that it does not actually have. Consciousness, on this view, is the brain's simplified, distorted model of what its attention is doing. The 2025 paper by Gorbachev and Frankish on the distortion thesis maps the space of possible illusionist theories more precisely. They propose a classification based on 3 dimensions: whether the distortion is positive, adding features that are not there, or negative, subtracting features that are; whether it is conceptual or non-conceptual; and whether it is dispellable through reflection or not. This yields 8 distinct patterns of distortion, each corresponding to a different hypothesis about how the illusion of phenomenality is generated. Illusionism's deepest unresolved challenge is what Frankish calls the illusion problem, providing a specific, empirically adequate account of how the brain generates the illusion of phenomenality. It is one thing to say that phenomenal properties are illusory. It is another to explain in mechanistic detail why the illusion is so powerful, so universal, so resistant to philosophical argument, and so difficult to dispel, even for those who are intellectually convinced it is an illusion. Until illusionists can explain the mechanism of the illusion with the same rigour that realists explain phenomenal consciousness, the position remains a promissory note rather than a completed theory. Part 23. The meta-problem of consciousness. Chalmers introduced the meta-problem in 2018 not as an alternative to the hard problem, but as a strategic lever. The meta-problem asks, why do we think there is a hard problem of consciousness? What is it about our cognitive architecture that produces the judgment that consciousness is hard to explain, that there is an explanatory gap, that zombies are conceivable, that Mary learns something new? The meta-problem is by design an easy problem. It asks about the causes of certain judgments, which are functional states. Explaining why someone makes a particular judgment is the kind of thing that computational and neural explanation can handle. We do not need to solve the hard problem to explain why people think there is one. The strategic importance of the meta-problem lies in the constraints a solution would impose on theories of consciousness. If we can explain in purely physical and functional terms why human beings are disposed to make problem reports, judgments that consciousness is hard to explain, then this explanation bears on the hard problem itself, though the direction of the bearing is contested. For the illusionist, a solution to the meta-problem would be a major vindication. If we can explain why people think consciousness is hard to explain without invoking consciousness itself, then the hard problem's apparent intractability might reflect features of our cognitive system rather than features of reality. The seeming mystery of consciousness would be like the seeming mystery of vital forces in 19th century biology, a product of our conceptual limitations, not of ontological recalcitrance. Chalmers himself, though not an illusionist, has acknowledged this explicitly. He has stated that if he were a materialist, he would be an illusionist, and that illusionism has been underexplored. He takes the view seriously precisely because a solution to the meta-problem in physical terms would provide the strongest possible argument for illusionism. For the non-illusionist, the meta-problem is still informative, but does not dissolve the hard problem. Explaining why we think consciousness is hard does not show that it is not hard. A debunking argument of that form would require an additional premise, that the meta-problem explanation is complete, that it accounts for everything about our epistemic situation regarding consciousness, including the fact that we are conscious. The non-illusionist argues that no purely functional explanation can be complete in this sense, because consciousness itself contributes something to our epistemic situation that functional explanation leaves out. Rosenthal has challenged the meta-problem's framing on different grounds. He argues that the problem intuitions Chalmers takes for granted, the judgments that consciousness is hard to explain, are widespread but potentially misleading, and that taking them as data to be explained insulates them from theoretical revision. A good theory of consciousness might show that these intuitions are simply wrong, that consciousness is not hard in the way the intuitions suggest. On this view, the meta-problem risks enshrining a philosophical prejudice as a datum. The meta-problem has generated a substantial literature, with 2 special issues of the Journal of Consciousness Studies devoted to it. What has emerged is that the meta-problem functions as a kind of loyalty test for positions in the consciousness debate. Your reaction to it, whether you see it as a path to dissolving the hard problem or as a sideshow, tracks your prior commitments about whether consciousness is genuinely mysterious or merely appears so. This is both the meta-problem's strength and its limitation. It clarifies the structure of the debate without resolving it. Part 24. Consciousness and Intentionality. Throughout the entire discussion so far, consciousness and intentionality have been treated as separate topics. Consciousness is about what it is like. Intentionality is about what mental states are about, their aboutness or directedness toward objects. The standard assumption in much of the philosophy of mind is that these are distinct and independently analyzable features of the mental. This assumption is increasingly under pressure. The separatist view holds that you can have consciousness without intentionality and intentionality without consciousness. A pure sensation, a raw qualitative feel with no representational content, would be consciousness without intentionality. An unconscious belief, a standing dispositional state that represents the world as being a certain way, would be intentionality without consciousness. If both dissociations are possible, the 2 phenomena are genuinely independent and require separate theories. The inseparatist view, defended in different forms by John Searle, Charles Seward, and more recently by Uriah Kriegel and Angela Mendelovici, argues that consciousness and intentionality are deeply entangled. On the strongest version, all genuine intentionality derives from consciousness. A belief represents the world as being a certain way, only because it is grounded in or derived from conscious experience that presents the world. Unconscious representations in cognitive science are representations only in a derivative, observer-relative sense, not intrinsically. Searle's formulation is the most familiar. The intrinsic intentionality of mental states derives from consciousness, and nothing else in nature has intrinsic intentionality. A thermostat represents temperature only relative to an observer who interprets it. A human being represents temperature through conscious experience of heat, and this representation is intrinsic, not dependent on external interpretation. This has direct consequences for the consciousness debate. If all intentionality derives from consciousness, then the representationalist theories of consciousness examined in Part 10 face a circularity problem. They explain consciousness in terms of representational content. But if representational content itself depends on consciousness, the explanation is circular. Consciousness is what makes representation possible, so you cannot explain consciousness by representation. Kriegel has tried to resolve this with his self-representational theory of consciousness. On his account, a conscious state is one that represents both its object and itself simultaneously. The state is conscious not because a separate higher-order state targets it, but because it has a built-in self-directed component. Intentionality toward the world and awareness of the experience occur within a single complex mental state. This avoids the regress problems of higher-order theories while preserving the link between consciousness and intentionality. The debate over the consciousness-intentionality relationship matters for a practical question that has become urgent in the 2020s. Whether artificial systems have mental states. If intentionality requires consciousness, then no system that lacks consciousness, however sophisticated its information processing, genuinely represents anything. The symbols in a language model have meaning only relative to human interpreters, not intrinsically. If intentionality is independent of consciousness, then sufficiently complex computational systems might have genuine representations, genuine aboutness, even if they are not conscious. The relationship between consciousness and intentionality thus constrains what we can say about machine minds, and the two debates are more connected than they appear. Part 25. Temporal experience and the unity of consciousness. Consciousness is not a static snapshot, but a continuous flow. This temporal character of experience, the fact that we hear a melody rather than a succession of isolated tones, poses a specific problem that most theories of consciousness fail to address. The problem was identified with precision by Edmund Husserl in the early 20th century. When you hear a melody, each note is experienced not in isolation, but as following the previous note and anticipating the next. The just-past note is not simply gone from consciousness. It is retained, experienced as just having been, while the upcoming note is pretended, experienced as about to arrive. The present moment of experience has a thickness that includes retention of the immediate past and pretension toward the immediate future. This is not a matter of memory. Memory is a separate cognitive act, a retrieval of stored information. Retention is part of the present experience itself. The difference is concrete. When you hear the third note of a melody, you do not remember the second note, and then consciously relate the memory to the third. You experience the second to third transition as a single, temporally extended, phenomenal event. The transition itself is part of what it is like to hear the melody. This poses a problem for any theory that identifies conscious experience with instantaneous neural states. If consciousness at a given moment is determined by the brain state at that moment, then the experience should be a snapshot, a frozen instant with no temporal extension. But experience is not like that. It has temporal depth, it includes the immediate past, and anticipates the immediate future within the present moment. Some theories attempt to handle this by invoking short-term memory buffers. The experience of temporal flow is not genuine temporal extension of consciousness, but a construction from memory traces within a specious present, a brief window of a few hundred milliseconds within which information is integrated. But this pushes the problem back. The specious present itself has duration, and its contents are experienced as temporally ordered, which means the original question recurs at the level of the specious present. IIT has recently attempted to address temporal experience within its framework. Comolati, Grasso, and Tononi have argued that the cause-effect structure unfolded from a substrate organized as a directed grid can account for why time feels like it flows. The temporal properties of experience correspond to specific structural features of the unfolded cause-effect structure. This is one of the first formal attempts to derive temporal phenomenology from a mathematical theory of consciousness, though it remains to be seen whether the approach can handle the full richness of temporal experience. The unity of consciousness is a closely related problem. At any moment you have a single unified experience that binds together visual, auditory, tactile, emotional and cognitive elements into one coherent whole. You do not have separate visual consciousness and auditory consciousness running in parallel. You have one consciousness with both visual and auditory components. The binding problem, as it is known in neuroscience, asks how the brain achieves this integration, given that visual, auditory and other modalities are processed in distinct cortical regions. But the philosophical problem is deeper than the neural one. Even if we identify the neural mechanism of binding, the question remains: why does integrating information into a single neural representation produce a single unified experience rather than multiple parallel experiences or no experience at all? Integration at the neural level does not logically entail unity at the phenomenal level, and the gap between the two is another form of the explanatory gap that no current theory has closed. Part 26. Enactivism and Embodied Approaches. Every theory discussed so far locates consciousness in the brain. Even those that disagree about where in the brain or which computational operation take for granted that consciousness is produced by neural activity. The enactive approach challenges this assumption, not by denying the brain's role, but by arguing that consciousness cannot be understood as a brain phenomenon at all. The founding text is Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche's The Embodied Mind from 1991. Their central claim is that cognition is not the processing of internal representations, but the enactment of a world by an embodied organism in dynamic coupling with its environment. The mind is not in the head. It is in the ongoing interaction between a living body and the environment it inhabits. Applied to consciousness, the enactive approach makes a specific claim about the relationship between life and mind. Thompson argues for a deep continuity between the two. The self-organizing, self-maintaining activity of a living organism, its autopoiesis, is the most basic form of what eventually becomes conscious experience. Even a single cell, by actively maintaining its boundary against entropic dissolution, instantiates a minimal form of sense-making, a distinction between self and non-self, between what matters for its continued existence and what does not. This is not itself consciousness, but it is the organizational precondition from which consciousness develops. Alvano's sensorimotor enactivism makes a different but related argument. Perceptual consciousness does not arise from neural representations of the world, but from the organism's practical mastery of the sensorimotor contingencies governing the relationship between its actions and sensory changes. Seeing is not having a picture in the head. It is knowing, in a practical and embodied sense, how changes in movement will change what you see. The experience of seeing a tomato includes an implicit grasp of how its appearance would change if you moved your head, how its backside would come into view if you rotated it, how its color would shift if the lighting changed. This sensorimotor knowledge is constitutive of visual experience, not a supplement to it. The approach has a distinctive strength. It handles the qualitative character of experience in a way that representational theories struggle with. Why does seeing feel different from hearing? Not because the neural representations have different intrinsic qualities, but because the sensorimotor contingencies for vision are fundamentally different from those for audition. Visual experience involves specific patterns of change under movement, such as occlusion and parallax, that have no auditory analogue. The feel of seeing is the pattern of sensorimotor engagement, not some additional phenomenal property layered on top of it. The central objection is that enactivism either changes the subject or fails to make progress on the hard problem. Andy Clark has argued that even granting the importance of embodied sensorimotor coupling, all the relevant information ultimately passes through the brain. The sensorimotor patterns are encoded in neural activity. The brain's predictive model of those patterns may be the actual vehicle of consciousness, with the body and environment providing the input rather than constituting the experience. On this reading, Enactivism provides a richer account of the content of consciousness, but says nothing new about its nature. Thompson has responded by arguing that this critique presupposes exactly the brain-bound framework that Enactivism rejects. The brain in a vat thought experiment, he argues, actually supports Enactivism. Any vat adequate to produce consciousness would need to be a surrogate body, functionally equivalent to an organism in an environment, which means the minimal system sufficient for consciousness includes the body and not just the brain. Whether this argument succeeds in establishing that consciousness is constitutively embodied, rather than merely causally dependent on embodiment, remains a central point of contention. Part 27. Non-Western Frameworks, Buddhist and Advaitic Contributions. The entire debate so far has been conducted within the Western analytic tradition, which took shape primarily in the 20th century. But sustained philosophical analysis of consciousness has been ongoing in South Asian traditions for over 2 millennia, and recent work by philosophers like Evan Thompson, J. Garfield, Monima Chadha, and Christian Koseru has begun integrating these resources into contemporary discussion in ways that are not merely comparative but genuinely argumentative. Buddhist philosophy of mind, particularly in the Yogacara and Madhyamaka traditions, offers a framework that disrupts several assumptions that Western approaches take for granted. The most fundamental disruption concerns the self. Western theories of consciousness assume, either explicitly or implicitly, a subject of experience. There is something it is like for me to see red. Buddhist analysis denies the existence of a unified, persisting self. Consciousness is a stream of momentary mental events, each arising dependent on conditions, with no enduring subject who has the experiences. This is not Eliminativism about consciousness. Buddhist philosophy is deeply realist about experience. The reality and intensity of suffering is the starting point of the entire tradition. What is denied is that experience requires a substantial, unified experiencer. The stream of consciousness is a causally connected series of momentary experiential events, each giving rise to the next, without any persisting entity threading them together. This directly engages the Western debate in a specific way. The subject combination problem in Panpsychism assumes that subjects are real entities that either combine or do not. If the Buddhist analysis is correct, and subjects are not entities at all, but merely convenient labels for streams of causally connected mental events, then the combination problem may be misconceived. Chadha's 2022 paper makes this argument explicitly, proposing a Buddhist response to the quality combination problem that dissolves rather than solves it by rejecting the ontology of subjects on which the problem depends. The Yogacara tradition developed a sophisticated account of the layers of consciousness that anticipates in structural terms several distinctions in contemporary theory. The storehouse consciousness, alaya vijnana, is a sub-personal level of processing that conditions surface-level experience without itself being experienced. The afflicted mind, manas, is a self-referential layer that constantly constructs the sense of a unified self by appropriating the contents of the storehouse. This resembles the higher-order theory's idea that consciousness involves a self-directed monitoring process, but with the crucial difference that the Buddhist analysis treats the self-directed process as a source of distortion rather than of consciousness itself. Advaita Vedanta offers a different non-Western resource. Sankara's tradition holds that consciousness, pure awareness, is the fundamental reality, and that the apparently plural, differentiated world of objects and subjects is a superimposition on an undivided, conscious ground. This bears structural resemblance to cosmopsychism. There is one consciousness, and individual subjects are derivative modifications of it. But the Advaitic framework adds something that cosmopsychism, in its Western form, typically lacks: a detailed account of the mechanisms of superimposition, avidya, or ignorance, through which the one consciousness appears as many. The productive integration of these traditions into analytic consciousness studies requires caution. The risk of flattening non-Western positions into Western categories, treating Buddhist no-self as a version of Eliminativism or Advaita as a version of Panpsychism, is real and distorts both sides. What these traditions genuinely contribute is not alternative answers to Western questions, but alternative questions that reveal unexamined assumptions in the Western framework. The assumption that consciousness requires a subject, the assumption that the fundamental problem is the relationship between consciousness and the physical, The assumption that introspection delivers reliable data about the structure of experience are all challenged by traditions that have centuries of rigorous philosophical development behind them. Part 28. Animal Minds and Machine Consciousness. The entire philosophy of consciousness converges on a practical question that has become urgent. Which systems are conscious, and how would we know? For animals, the question has empirical traction. We share evolutionary history, neural architecture, and behavioral repertoires with other mammals, and, to a decreasing degree, with birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and invertebrates. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness in 2012 stated that the neurological substrates generating consciousness in humans are also present in many non-human animals. But this claim rests on structural analogy, not on direct access to animal experience, and the degree of confidence it warrants decreases rapidly as we move away from organisms with brain structures similar to ours. The philosophical difficulty is that every method we have for detecting consciousness in others relies on some form of inference from observable behavior or neural structure to unobservable experience. For humans, we supplement behavioral evidence with verbal report, and with the assumption that beings structurally similar to us have similar experiences. For non-human animals, report is unavailable, and structural similarity is a matter of degree. For octopuses, which have distributed nervous systems radically different from ours, and for insects, whose neural systems are tiny and architecturally alien, the inference becomes extremely tenuous. Each theory of consciousness yields different verdicts on animal minds. Global workspace theory requires a global broadcasting mechanism, which plausibly exists in mammals and birds, but is debatable for fish and invertebrates. IIT yields consciousness for any system with sufficient integrated information, which could include insects and even very simple organisms. Higher-order theories require meta-representational capacities, which are likely restricted to a narrower range of species. Panpsychism attributes some form of experience to all physical systems, making the question not whether animals are conscious, but to what degree and with what content. For machines, the question is even more fraught. Large language models produce outputs that, in many contexts, are indistinguishable from the outputs of conscious beings. They respond to questions about their experience, describe their feelings, and engage in sophisticated metacognitive discourse. The question is whether any of this reflects genuine experience or whether it is sophisticated pattern matching with no inner life. The philosophical positions developed in this series constrain the possible answers. If functionalism is true and consciousness is determined entirely by causal role structure, then sufficiently complex artificial systems could in principle be conscious, provided they implement the right functional organization. If consciousness requires specific biological properties, as Enactivism and some forms of Russellian Monism suggest, then no digital computer is conscious regardless of its functional complexity. If IIT is correct, the answer depends on the integrated information of the artificial system, and Tononi has argued that standard feed-forward architectures, regardless of their size, have near zero phi, and are therefore not conscious. The practical stakes are enormous. If future AI systems are conscious, then they may have moral status, and our treatment of them would matter ethically. If they are not conscious, then even convincing claims of experience on their part are performative rather than genuine, and no moral obligation arises. The inability of current theory to settle this question is not merely an academic embarrassment. It is a gap in our conceptual framework that has consequences for how we build, deploy, and regulate the most powerful technologies of the coming decades. Part 29. Mysterianism, Cognitive Closure, and the Limits of Theory. After 28 parts of sustained argument, a final possibility must be taken seriously: that the problem of consciousness may be unsolvable by human minds. This is not intellectual surrender, but a specific philosophical position with its own arguments, and those arguments are stronger than they are usually given credit for. Colin McGinn's cognitive closure thesis, developed in the late 1980s and refined since, makes a precise claim. Human cognitive faculties evolved to solve certain kinds of problems: navigating the physical environment, predicting the behavior of conspecifics, tracking resources and threats. There is no evolutionary reason to expect that these faculties are equipped to solve every theoretical problem we can formulate. The relationship between consciousness and the brain may be a problem whose solution requires conceptual resources that are, as a matter of cognitive fact, beyond what human minds can construct. The analogy McGinn uses is a rat trying to solve a prime number theorem. The rat is not stupid in any absolute sense. It is extremely sophisticated at solving the problems its cognitive equipment was designed for. But number theory is simply not in its cognitive repertoire. There is no training regime, no amount of exposure, no environmental enrichment that would give a rat access to the proof. McGinn argues that humans may be to the consciousness problem what rats are to number theory: permanently and constitutively incapable. The position is not that consciousness is supernatural or non-physical. McGinn is a naturalist. He believes consciousness is a natural phenomenon with a natural explanation. The explanation exists in the way that the laws of physics exist independent of anyone knowing them. But the explanation may require concepts that are cognitively inaccessible to us, concepts that, like the concepts of quantum mechanics for the rat, we cannot even form. The most precise objection to Mysterianism targets its self-undermining structure. If we cannot know the solution to the mind-body problem, how can we know that we cannot know it? The claim of cognitive closure seems to require exactly the kind of cognitive access to the problem space that it denies we have. To know that the solution exists but is inaccessible, we would need to know enough about the solution to know that it exceeds our capacities. McGinn's reply is that we can sometimes know the shape of our ignorance without knowing the content of what we are ignorant of. We can know that some problems are harder than others, that our cognitive architecture has limitations, and that the persistent failure of every approach to consciousness, despite centuries of effort by brilliant minds, is itself evidence that we may be hitting a wall rather than merely lacking the right theory. The inference is abductive, not deductive. The best explanation of persistent failure may be cognitive inadequacy rather than insufficient effort. A more nuanced version of the Mysterian position has emerged in the 2020s. Rather than claiming total cognitive closure, some philosophers argue for partial closure. We can make progress on certain aspects of consciousness, the easy problems, the meta-problem, perhaps even some features of the hard problem, but the complete solution is beyond reach. This is compatible with ongoing scientific and philosophical progress, while acknowledging that some questions may not have answers accessible to beings with our cognitive makeup. The Mysterian position functions as a constraint on the entire field. It forces every other position to address the possibility that the difficulty of the consciousness problem is not contingent, but constitutive, not a sign of insufficient cleverness, but of genuine cognitive limitation. If Mysterianism is wrong, then one of the other approaches will eventually succeed, and we will understand why consciousness exists and how it relates to the physical world. If Mysterianism is right, then the honest conclusion is that we have reached the boundary of human understanding on this particular question, and that consciousness will remain, for beings like us, the deepest mystery in nature. This is not a satisfying ending. But the philosophy of consciousness is not a field that earns its value by providing satisfying endings. It earns its value by making the questions precise enough that we can distinguish genuine answers from hand-waving, genuine progress from circular reasoning, and genuine mystery from failures of attention. Whether or not the hard problem is solvable, the work of making it sharp, constraining the space of possible solutions and exposing the hidden costs of every position has irreplaceable intellectual value. That work continues,